It's always interesting whenever artists talk about their own work because I always end up looking at what they created from a new lens or a new perspective. You ask most artists about their work, they're going to have a story for you, an experience, a new context to look at the music that they just put that record out in. But very rarely do I ever see people say that their music was a joke. Like, haha. I'm pretty sure Clickbait was one of the most interesting songs of 2019. And not because it was good, but because of how surprisingly awful it was, from the lens of a guy who was trying extremely hard not to be bothered with like criticism on the internet of his music. Like Clickbait, although the song was awful, like downright one of the worst things I've heard from Logic in his whole career, one of the worst things that came out of 2019, one of the worst things in general. When I heard that song, I actually was proud that Logic was so candid about how internet comments made him feel, whether they were positive or negative, and the perception that they gave him of himself, and how they could give most people a perceived notion about themselves that might not entirely be true. That didn't seem like a joke. That didn't seem like satire. It was a bad song with a good message. And Logic was pretty candid, or seemed pretty candid, about that ideology throughout the whole album, was that he wanted people to take away from it that, hey, I get affected by this shit too, in the same way that you might, and I'm telling you the ways that I've learned to deal with it that have made my life a bit easier. I mean, come on, go through the lyrics of Clickbait, bro. Just go through the lyrics of a lot of these songs. Logic is making it seem like people wanted him to legitimately disappear from the face of the planet because he put out a couple of disappointing records. This is not a joke. Who are you making fun of? This album seemed like a record that was very much so made for the guy who lives a lot and spends a lot of his time on the internet, or is having a hard time trying to distance himself from the online, atmosphere versus his real life. And if I look at it from that context and that perspective, I, like I said, appreciate the message. Execution is a totally different story. But if I'm to take that message as a joke, as Logic says that it was intended, are you making fun of the people that have that same way of life? He also titles it a controversial album, which what was the controversy behind that album? The only controversy I remember was fans coming to the realization that Logic might have been somewhat close to what a lot of his detractors may have been saying about him for years up until that point, because his fans shit all over the project. I mean, that's rare, where even the artist's hardcore fan base gets tricked into believing that it's a real project too. I mean, he must be that good. And that's the thing about this take that confuses me, is that it would be extremely believable had Logic dropped nothing but great records and great albums up until this point. If he had dropped nothing but, almost certified banger and classic after classic record, and then he just drops mid out of nowhere. If he had a significant dip in quality to such an extent, I think this would be far more believable. But the fact that Confessions of a Dangerous Mind isn't that far of a jump for Logic in terms of what people expect from him, the fact that people believe that this could be a serious project from you says a lot about your career up until that point, does it not? An artist 3 years post that record having to tell people that it was actually a joke because everyone thought that this was possible coming from you in the first place is a bigger insult to you than it is to the people that you're making a joke out of, right? And the thing about Confessions of a Dangerous Mind is that it was everything that was bad about Logic building up into a certain point. Logic has shown signs of, I won't say declining in quality, but adding elements to his records that weren't necessary for a while, like taking certain influences and maybe driving them a little bit too far on records from The Incredible True Story. Some of those influences leaking over into Everybody. Some longer than necessary records off of Young Sinatra 4 until we ultimately got to Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, where all of it had culminated into an intolerable project. And honestly, I think it would be more to Logic's benefit to admit that he just dropped this record and people didn't receive it well, as opposed to it being an intentional joke. Because if that's the case, that means you made shit music knowing that your audience would support it unironically. It just seems like a bit of a slap in the face of the people that have supported you for so long to all of a sudden say, now I'm making clown music and whoever doesn't get it is going to look like the clown later for supporting me. And if this was a joke, what does that make Supermarket? Supermarket wasn't a joke? That was real? I mean, the single leading into Confessions of a Dangerous Mind was actually pretty good. I actually enjoyed that a lot. It got me hype for what the album could potentially be, because it was the best Logic had sounded in months. Saying that it was social commentary or a perspective of how I feel about social media or what I want people to take away from my social media experience, I think would have been far better received as opposed to a satirical social experiment. Because that implies too much intention on Logic's behalf. And with the quality of the record and what we ended up getting, I just don't think that that was the case. And when Logic says shit like this, it just makes me feel like he doesn't understand that everyone doesn't have to like you. Everyone doesn't have to like what you put out. It would feel great if everyone did, but personally, I fear what looking idiotic to this high of a degree will do to my image more than releasing a mid or so-so project. I would be more worried about how people would respond to me trying to cover up the criticism of that album by saying that it was a satirical social experiment, as opposed to how they would look at me as if I just dropped a bad record. And it does sadden me to a degree looking at what Logic was trying to convince people of and the ideas and the messages that he was trying to put onto bodies of work like Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. Because the central theme of that record, I feel like, is how big of an impact criticism, social media, onlookers, detractors, even people that support his records have had on his mental state. I mean, we look at this record, he's literally splitting himself apart. The commentary about Logic is driving him crazy. It's making him go mad. It's not having the best impact on him. And that is the basic message that he is trying to allow listeners in on. That is the mental state that he is trying to allow his audience into. Look at what it's doing to me. These are the wounds, these are the scars. You all know me as the guy who had to come up from almost impossible circumstances, almost impossible odds. When you're listening to Logic on Under Pressure, you're hearing a version of him whose biggest challenge is the environment around him, whose biggest obstacle is nicotine addiction, childhood trauma due to unfit parenting, drugs in his neighborhood, in his community, the hood in general. That same guy is telling you that social media and what people say is the next biggest challenge to me, so much so that I'm making an entire album about it damn near, to let y'all know that this isn't the only pitfall that I've had to go through. I made it through all of that just to get to this point and still feel like I'm not good enough from people who don't know me. That's not that complicated of an idea to get when listening to Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. Even if you don't like the album, you can still admit, okay, that's kind of powerful now that we look at it from that perspective. But the album's still trash, and that's okay. Execution and intent are two totally different things. It's natural that people, as they come up, as they move up the ladder, are going to have new obstacles, and that was one of Logic's. We can't all of a sudden discard that part of his career because he doesn't want to admit that it was just a bad record and people didn't respond to it the way he thought they would. I don't have high hopes for the new Logic album, but I will definitely be tuning in if his audience tells me that it is great and it's some of the best that they've heard from him over the last couple of years. I'll definitely listen to it. But it just gives me fear for whatever is in the future. Is there going to be an unironic rollout followed by a, hey, I was just joking, it's not actually bad, I was actually just trolling? If your detractors are going to end up dictating the context of a record, should you be making music? If you are that easily swayed by criticism, like, should the music that you make really be held to a high regard if you could just so easily abandon it because of some criticism? Y'all hop in the comment box and let me know what you think. Was this a social experiment and it just went over most people's heads, or is Logic wilding again?